Thanks, Dave. An Adams County man will now spend 3 years in jail after nearly a dozen dogs were found neglected on his property. You may remember last month, deputies found multiple starving animals on Jeremy Johnson's property following a 911 tip. The Adams County Sheriff's Office says Judge Danny Barber found Johnson guilty of 6 counts of simple cruelty to a dog. He was sentenced to 3 years behind bars and fined $1,000 per count, totaling $6,000. His remaining charges were remanded to Justice Court.